So when we're talking about unemployment, and specifically about structural unemployment, it's a pretty complex topic, and it's a pretty important one. So let's talk about this idea of sticky wages, because that has much larger ramifications than just explaining unemployment. It also helps us get into understanding why there's recessions, understanding the shape of the aggregate supply curve when we get into our big macroeconomic model. And so it's really at the heart of understanding movements in the macroeconomy. So let's get started. So what we aim to cover, what are sticky wages and how do they contribute to unemployment? So if you've had an economics class before, or even if you haven't, this graph should be pretty familiar to you. Basically, you're looking at the supply for something and the demand for something. In this particular case, it's labor that's the good. So the supply curve of labor is upward sloping. People that are supplying labor are willing to work more for higher wages, so that positive relationship between the quantity they offer and the price at which they're getting paid for their labor. And then the demand for labor, it comes from employers that want to hire people. They, of course, like it when their costs are lower, and so we find that as for them, the only thing that gets them to hire more is when the price goes down. So you have a upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, and now we can talk about equilibrium price for that thing. So there's an equilibrium wage for a given labor market with a given specific skill set, all those things. There's lots of different labor markets with different types of people and different types of skills, but we can assume that there is an equilibrium wage rate for this thing. All right, so if you've ever taken an econ class, or even if you haven't, this graph should look familiar. You've got an upward sloping supply for a good and a downward sloping demand for a good. In this case, it's labor, that's the good in question, and we have an upward sloping supply because the people that are supplying labor, the workers, will work more when the wage rate rises. So there's a positive relationship between those two variables. Meanwhile, the people hiring the labor, the demanders, the employers, they're experiencing the opposite sort of relationship between wage and quantity. They like to hire more people when the costs are lower. So because they're under cost constraints and because they want more profit, they're going to hire more people when wage rates are lower. So it's a negative relationship in between the wage rate and the quantity of labor demanded for the employers. Okay, so that leaves us here. The magic of the market, or one of the most magical things about the market, is that it clears, it finds an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is so important because it leaves no resources unused. Everything sort of settles out and relaxes. Also, it can change over time. And the fact that markets can increase people's wages when the demand for labor rises in a certain industry. Let's say yo-yos get super popular and people can't get enough yo-yos. You'd want more workers in the yo-yo market, and that's exactly what happens when the price goes up for yo-yo makers. That will make yo-yo making more attractive. People will leave other types of industries and come work in that industry. All in all, the market has some really good things about it. That's assuming that the market's a well-functioning market. A couple of assumptions here. That it's competitive, there's full information, all sorts of things. There's lots of pretty strict assumptions that we use in economics when describing how beautiful markets are. They have to meet our assumptions. And real-world markets aren't always that way. In fact, here's a real-world market where the wage is not allowed to come down. Let's say there's a minimum wage law, or let's say there's some other thing going on where the wages don't fall. Instead, they stay higher than the equilibrium. What's going to happen there? You're going to get a situation where there's more people willing to work at that wage than there are people willing to hire people at that wage. So there's unemployment caused by sticky wages. And that knowledge is going to be really important as we build our models of recession and economic downturns. But for now, let's turn our attention to what might cause those sticky wages. So if we consider that people like stability, then we can agree that it might be the case, the custom in an economy where the employer offers pretty stable contracts so that you don't experience a big upswing or downswing in your wages, right? Because most of our income comes directly from working for wages. And it can be really destabilizing when your wage rate changes. So although it's good for the market to let prices go wherever they want to be, it's not good for the people that are working for those wages, who depend on those wages for income, to have them be unpredictable. So that's one reason you might see wage rates not moving around as much as they should. In other words, they're sticky. Another reason is efficiency wage theory. The theory that productivity of workers, either individually or as a group, will increase if the employer pays them more. And likewise, they get less turnover and don't have to pay the retraining costs for new hires, etc. So there's something to firms maybe wanting to pay efficiency wages, and clearly that makes the wages be above their equilibrium level and will cause some unemployment perhaps, because a lot more people want to work at the higher wages than perhaps there are jobs available. And finally, the adverse selection of wage cuts argument. If employers reduce wages for all workers, the best will leave. Right, these are the workers that have the most options available and will usually be the first to leave. So cutting wages is going to perhaps cut your best workers. So try to avoid dropping your wages is the mantra here. And now you have sticky wages. And further, you can have this idea that insiders know the ropes a little bit better and so sort of deserve those higher wages. And that might explain why wages are slow to drop. And right, even as the economy starts to falter, you want to sort of keep the wages high because those people on the inside do know something that the outsiders don't. And finally, relative wage coordination. It's really hard for firms across the board to cut wages, and usually people are pretty angry about that, and so workers fight against those wage cuts. Admittedly, they don't have as much power now that unions are on the decline fairly substantially, but still it's difficult to cut wages and keep worker morale up. So theoretically, if there were no sticky wages, we would see that when there's an increase in demand for something, for like labor, you would see an increase in its price or the wage rate. And likewise, when there's a decrease or leftward shift in the quantity demanded of something at every price, you would see a downward shift in price. And the market would once again arrive at equilibrium. But notice, if the wage rate stays high, even after that downward shift, like you might get during a recession, you're going to find unemployment. Right? That's your unemployment level coming from the failure of that market to reduce wages and for wages to stay stuck above their equilibrium level. Another reason you might see some unemployment, and this would be structural unemployment, is if the economy were doing well for a period of years or maybe decades and productivity is rising, right? So workers are producing more per hour. Perhaps that's because we're better educated. Perhaps that's because of technological improvements that increase our productivity. But regardless, what happens is that we become more valuable to our employers, and that pushes the demand curve to the right and should push, other things equal, the price of labor up, right? So you should see these increases in wage rate as we go increase productivity. But at some point, and this has happened several times in the last 50 years, productivity stalls. And so while people are used to getting raises of, 5% per year because productivity was rising, now productivity is no longer risen, but they're used to that increase in wages. And so you might have at W4, that's if the wage were to keep rising like it did before, you might consider that there's going to be unemployment because you're paying your workers more, but they're not gaining you as much as the wage. They're not gaining you in productivity and profit and revenue as much as the wage rate that you increased for them. And now focusing our attention on the right graph, the opposite can happen, right? You could be used to stable wages for a long time, then all of a sudden you get a productivity increase and you were happy with the low wages. Well, now you have a situation where the demand is actually higher. And the sticky wages, the fact that wages are stuck below the new equilibrium is also going to be a problem, but it's going to be a different kind of a problem. It's going to be that employers are having a hard time filling the vacancies, right? Because there's a higher demand than there is supply at that price. And lo and behold, unemployment rate will be really, really low, might be below the natural rate. Speaking of that natural rate of unemployment, the frictional plus structural, let's talk about where it is for the U.S. So currently, the U.S. natural unemployment rate, believe it or not, is kind of on the decline, meaning that we should expect there to basically for us to stabilize if the economy is working well at a lower unemployment rate. So we can still have recessions that'll push it above this natural rate, but it should be 4.5% to 5.5%, which is on the decline. So why is that? The internet has helped us find jobs and match jobs to people a lot faster. The temp industry is huge in America, and that is a way also to sort of get around the waiting time for the job search. And then the aging baby boom generation is clearly a very big deal as well. They're just exiting the labor force in mass quantities. So here's a look at the CBO's estimate of the natural unemployment rate as of the end of September in 2020. And you can see even with some pretty big recessions, we don't know how long this recession will last, but it looks like, for reasons noted before, that the trajectory is for a natural rate of unemployment to continue to decline. Circling back around to that idea of sticky wages, here's some data. Real gross domestic product per capita production, basically, in red, has been rising. And it used to track pretty closely with it, but now this lower line, which represents the household income, median household income, no longer tracks with it. So productivity is rising, but wages, household income is not rising in conjunction with it, at least. So there's a lot of curiosity in the world of economics about this and a lot of different explanations being thrown about. But one of the key ones is that this rise has to do with rising power of firms and falling power of unions. So a relative strengthening of the bargaining position of employers and a relative weakening of the bargaining position of workers.